Legislating and regulating the development of electricity is exclusively a provincial responsibility under our Constitution, and no good intentions can make up for overstepping the limits of the law. The federal electricity regulations will create a system that is massively unaffordable, dangerously unreliable, and utterly unconstitutional.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News. Very happy to be joined by Rebecca Schulz, the Minister for Environment and Protected Areas here with Alberta, providing an update now that there's officially been put forward a Sovereignty Act motion. We've had a couple conversations. We've discussed production caps, gas-powered vehicle bans, carbon tax carve-outs, single-use plastic bans, among the litany of sort of federal unconstitutional and problematic sort of advancements against, in many ways, allegedly for the environment, but very many ways against Alberta's interests. Why is the net zero electricity grid like the straw that broke the camel's back as far as actually bringing forward a Sovereignty Act motion?
I think part of it was the timing, of course, because this was the first piece of major policy that the federal government brought forward when they went to Canada Gazette 1 with their clean electricity regulations. And at that point, Premier and our team saw just how problematic that draft was, and that was really what sparked the motion for the Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act and really protecting our provincial jurisdiction around electricity development.
Premier Smith, I wanted to get your response to Minister Guilbeault in the House of Commons this morning. He called the sovereignty legislation symbolic. He says you don't take symbolic legislation to court. Just your response to that.
Well, he will learn that if he does not back down from his outrageous and unconstitutional targets of 2035, it'll be more than symbolic. We'll proceed with developing our baseload power on natural gas with the best available technology.
And what we saw, we provided this information to the federal government. In fact, after the election, Premier Smith came in and said, look, let's restart this relationship. Let's show we can work together. Let's set up these bilateral tables. We'll have these discussions. Unfortunately, the federal government chooses not to listen, whether that be to our electricity generators, and not just Alberta, but other provinces as well, about the concerns about affordability and reliability of our electricity grid. And then just recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I guess maybe a month ago now, the federal government came out with a bit of a paper or an update in terms of what we heard on the clean electricity regulations. And they said, look, we recognize, we've heard this is problematic. We understand that there are risks to affordability and reliability. And we're working to address those, just trust us. But then they literally have TBD in their document about how they're going to address it. And unfortunately, that is just not what you would expect in a cooperative federalism, where these policies are going to have an impact on everyday Albertans and everyday Canadians, and we as a provincial government who's responsible for that area of jurisdiction, just leaving us to figure it out is completely unacceptable. So that's really why we're in this situation right now.
And what does the Sovereignty Act motion, what does it mean in practice? What changes? Is there sort of does it give it more legal footing? What changes in practice for Albertans?
That's part of it, and I think as Premier usually refers to it as a constitutional shield, right? That we are putting this legislation in place to reiterate essentially what is in the Constitution, that this is an area of provincial jurisdiction, but then also really outline that we ultimately are responsible, and this might mean that we have to do some things differently moving forward to protect really the affordability and reliability of our electricity grid for all Albertans. Premier has said, look, carbon neutrality is something that we can work towards. In fact, our major electricity generators, they have said, we think we can get to carbon neutral by 2050. Our approach is to work with industry, right? Because we need to be realistic about the policies that we put in place and what the path looks like to 2050. And that's exactly right. I mean, when the federal government then is saying, no, our goal is 2030, and it's going to require, for example, performance standards that would require technology that hasn't been tested, in fact, doesn't even exist. Nobody's going to invest in that natural gas baseload when they know that this is the federal government's requirement to essentially shut them down in a few short years. And so I think that's really the challenge here. And our approach has been reasonable. Look, we actually largely agree I don't want to say we largely agree, but we have goals to reduce emissions further, and our industry recognizes we can get there by 2050. Allow us to do what we need to do to ensure that there is power for Albertans when they flip on the switch in the middle of the night. We saw what happened in January, right, with the grid alert and the concerns there when it is cold and the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. We've heard those examples before. We have a responsibility to meet the needs of Albertans, and we can't have the federal government jeopardizing essentially the investment and that, I would say, base load capacity to power our grid in the best interest of Albertans. So that's why we're here.
Yeah, no, you hit something on the head there. The sort of notion of the best interest of Albertans. Is 2050 net zero in the best interest of Albertans? I've asked Premier Smith this as well, but in some regards, when a conservative government is in many ways agreeing with a very left-wing liberal government, is that really in the best interest of sort of a conservative Alberta? Is it simply following industry? Why are we using sort of the same language that they're using?
Yeah, well, and this is where I said, we don't always agree, because I think the language we use is actually, certainly the language I use is a lot different than what you hear coming out of Minister Guilbeault. So, our approach is yes, it is to work with industry, but it's to make sure that we are maintaining that affordable, reliable grid and using common sense as we get there. Because, of course, if you ask Albertans, do you care about the environment? I think the answer is yes.
With the nature of the term Sovereignty Act, is the position of this government that this government won't agree to the terms of the federal government, or that this is exclusively provincial jurisdiction, and while you're willing to maybe have conversations with the federal government, ultimately they don't have a say?
That is almost exactly what we have articulated in all of our correspondence with the federal government. Essentially that, look, we're going to provide you with all of the research and the data and the impacts, all of that information that we have, that we've compiled by working amongst government departments and, of course, with our major industries. However, just because we're providing you this information does not mean that we recognize the work that you're doing in our jurisdiction. We fundamentally will continue to assert our provincial jurisdiction when it comes to the development of electricity here in our province. And same with, as we've talked before about the oil and gas emissions cap, same thing when it comes to energy development. Yeah. And so all of our communication with the federal government reiterates that this is an area of provincial jurisdiction. We maintain that. We will fight for that. And that said, we're going to provide you with the feedback so maybe you can make some changes to what you're putting forward that actually reflects the reality of what we're seeing in Alberta and in other places across the country. Look, the federal government, they believe that, and emissions reduction, that is federal jurisdiction. However, development of energy is provincial. And no matter how you slice it, what the federal government is putting forward will absolutely impact production. And I think, again, on this front, when we talk to Albertans, and I think increasingly Canadians, about common sense policy and what we want to see moving forward, I think there's recognition, again, we are doing our part. We are reducing emissions in oil and gas, methane emissions reduction. We've reduced our methane emissions by 45%. That was our first interim goal, 3 years ahead of schedule, by working with industry, not against them. But when we look at our energy demands, not just here, but globally, they are going up every single day. Alberta needs to be part of the solution. Again, though, they are so vague on, it sometimes seems like it's changing timelines, right? Yeah. I think obviously you see a federal government that is somewhat in free fall in the polls, and sometimes the timelines and the goalposts on some of these things are changing. But you know what, if that's the next thing that we see them bring forward in terms of drafts. Originally, they said later this year. Now we're hearing it might be moved up. Then this could be potentially the second example that you see when it comes to the Alberta Sovereignty within United Canada Act. But, this is important. And even last week, it was our first week back up in the legislature, a number of our colleagues were talking about the importance of this motion, of this legislation, of asserting our rights here in Alberta and our jurisdiction and our responsibilities that are enshrined in the Constitution. This is a fight we're going to have, and as I've said before, to Minister Guilbeault, we will see you in court over these. And given their record, I am confident about how that would work out for Alberta and other provinces, given what we saw in Bill C-69, plastics, right? Unreasonable and unconstitutional. Yeah. And despite the fact that Minister Guilbeault thinks those are just opinions of the highest courts in our land, those are decisions that then instruct future legislation here in Canada. So we'll continue to fight. We'll continue to stand up for affordable, reliable electricity and energy, and really protect our provincial jurisdiction.
Well, with the government in free fall, obviously folks in Alberta are very concerned about any attacks that may result. Hopefully the courts get it right, and hopefully things like these Sovereignty Act motions can go a long way to ensuring that Albertans aren't left in the dark. I want to thank Minister Rebecca Schulz for your time. Thank you so much. And for everyone at home, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Hey guys, if you reject the radical environmental policies being pushed by globalists on Albertans and Canadians, please sign our petition at nogreenreset.com.